All right, so I want to talk now about the influence of Neoplatonism on the Renaissance. But first I want to say that this video is sponsored by a new publisher out of Palm Beach, Florida called Gallo Glass Books. And this is their debut publication here, is to gather up the works of the primary Neoplatonists, Plotinus, who is its source, other than Plato, Porphyry, and Proclus as monad. And it's translated by Thomas Taylor, who lived in the 19th century. He's not contemporary with us now. And it has an introduction by Ken Wheeler. And it's a beautiful book. It's a limited edition of 2,000 copies, but there's only about 750 left, just to mention that. And it's just beautifully designed. You can see it here on their site, and this is where you purchase it, on their site. All right, so that's Gallo Glass Books, Monad, by Plotinus, Porphyry, and Proclus. I highly recommend it. Okay, so let's go to, let's see here, let's go to Arvind Panofsky's diagram here. He gives a very helpful diagram in his book Studies in Iconology, and I highly recommend all of Panofsky's works, and also Edgar Vent's book, Pagan Mysteries in the Renaissance. They're both excellent for this subject matter. So we have over here on the right, we've got the cosmos laid out by Plotinus, which essentially moves from the one, and the one is equivalent to the Hindu idea of Brahman. Plotinus knew about the Indian philosophical tradition. His teacher was Ammonius Saccas, and he taught him the basics of Indian philosophy, so he knew it. So he knew that the one very well corresponded to the Brahman. And then it emanates nous, N-O-U-S, which is the cosmic mind. In Latin, it becomes mens. In Greek, it's nous. That's the cosmic mind that carries out, it's incorruptible. And it's the realm of the forms, Plato's ideas, the forms. And here it would correspond in Christian cosmology to the empyrean, which is the realm of the angelic beings, who are the makers. The form makers, as I call them in my novel. That create the physical universe, which emanates the third emanation, which is that of anima mundi, and that brings in the planets and astrology. And it is indeed a deterministic cosmos, Plotinus's model, to a point, only for the lower soul, the anima secunda, not the anima prima. And so we've got the spheres, and then finally we've got nature. And nature has two forms: formed matter, and matter as pure receptivity to form, which only exists theoretically, not actually. Things have to incarnate in a material substratum in order to exist in the realm of nature, which is influenced then by the planets. And so here is the Latin version of it with the mens over here, mens mundana, the intellectus divinus sive angelicus, and the empyrean, and then the realm of the fixed stars, stelli fixi, Saturnus, Jupiter, Mars, Sol, Venus, Mercury, Luna, and the spiritus mundanus, and then nature, natura, and materia. Okay, so that is the macrocosm. Now, the macrocosm of the human soul is over here on the left, which corresponds to it at every step. So once again, we have the mens, which is equivalent to the Plotinian nous. But note that the soul is divided into two halves, the anima prima and the anima secunda, which very much resembles Spengler's idea in The Decline of the West of Dasein, his version of Dasein, not Heidegger's. Dasein versus Wachsein. Waking being is Wachsein. That corresponds to anima prima, which is the ratio and the mens. And then the anima secunda is composed of all the five senses, the imagination, and the faculty for generating reproduction, basically. So those basically correspond in the Kundalini to the lower chakras. Chakras 1 through 3, which are the animal motivations, and then the upper chakras correspond to ratio, which is the first layer of anima prima, and then above that the mens, which connects the psyche to nous, or connects the soul, the anima, to mens. It's the same idea in Hinduism, the immersion of the microsoul, the Atman, into the macrosoul of the Brahman. So that's the model, and now what the Renaissance artists are doing is translating concepts into images. They're doing a left brain, right brain dance, and what has stimulated it is the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and all of these Greek monks flee, bearing precious texts with them that the West does not yet have. And one of these guys is named Gemistus Pletho. His last name is obviously based on the name of Plato. Pletho, Pletho. And they go to Florence and Ravenna, but in Florence they bring with them all these works, the works of Plato, which up till then we had only had in the West, I think, the Timaeus. But the entire rest of the works of Plato, the whole bunch of the books of the Corpus Hermeticum, and then, of course, these Neoplatonic texts, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and so forth, all of those guys. And so once they got this gold mine of texts, they were extremely excited. Under Lorenzo de' Medici, he was the sort of guy who was the head aristocrat sponsoring these guys. And the two main scholars were Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. Pico della Mirandola was a very precocious young philosopher. He wrote his best works in his late teens and early 20s, exactly as did Schelling. Schelling was also extremely precocious and was publishing works at the age of 17, 18, astonishing in complexity for such a young man. And there is indeed a huge Neoplatonic influence on Schelling. We'll look at that perhaps in a separate video here. What we're looking at right now is from an obscure book by a guy named Gaffurius. The book is called the Practica Musici, and it's a sort of summation of the cosmos, of the Neoplatonic world combined with Christianity. And so what we have here, it's almost a reversal of the Kundalini Yoga. Remember that in Kundalini Yoga, you begin with the serpent going up the central spinal axis called Sushumna, and you get it to ascend through the chakras. First you have to balance the two yin and yang meridians, the Ida and Pingala, and then the serpent ascends toward unification with the Sahasrara chakra, which corresponds to Dante's white rose. So these symbols are interconvertible across the universal tradition going across the earth. This is all human learning and erudition. It has nothing to do with colonialization, as the Academy now tries to present, to criticize great universalist thinkers like Joseph Campbell or William Irwin Thompson, individuals like that. So note here that we have Apollo at the top. This would correspond actually to the Agya chakra, which is the third eye chakra, which is the chakra that beholds the forms or any kind of visions. In astrology, this would correspond to Neptune, the planet of the imagination, the collective unconscious, and all of that. And so to his right, he has the three graces, and now the three graces are a trifold manifestation of the power of Venus. And Euphrosyne here is facing away from the splendor of God. Aglaia here is facing the splendor of the God being, and Talia is in between. Talia is in between. So we have the soul's descent when it takes on the clothing. Clothing is the various subtle bodies. Inanna, in her descent into the underworld, has to shed 7 items of clothing at each of the 7 gates until she stands naked before her sister in the underworld, Ereshkigal, who's the mistress of the dead. Inanna is the planet Venus, the mistress of the great above. And there are echoes from ancient Sumer going on here. It's astonishing when you have a tradition with this much power. The echoes. And over here on his right, he's got flowers, the abundance that the Apollo brings. He brings music, he brings poetry. But we've got other chakras too. We've got Dionysus chakras as well. And so as we descend here to incarnation on Earth down to Terra, here we have the 3 animals that Dante encounters in the first book of the Inferno, the lion, the leopard, and the wolf. And we've got Talia down here again, only now she's silent. Surda Talia, silent Talia, because the soul has had a wipe, the amnesic wipe. We're not allowed to remember our past lives because the spirits don't want us repeating tasks that didn't work or going after people to even scores and so forth. They want us to start afresh. And so that's why we have the memory wipe. And here are the spheres of the elements: Ignis, air, that's fire, air, water, earth. And this all corresponds to Luna. And these are the 9 muses over here, which correspond to these celestial spheres over here. Clio is in opposition to Urania. And that's the difference between becoming. Clio is the muse of history and hence temporality, becoming. and then the ascent up above through the 9 muses, each one being a personification of one or another of the arts, dance, epic poetry, lyric poetry, and so on, until you get to Urania, who corresponds to the constellations of the fixed stars of the zodiac, and so forth. Then we have the individual planets over here: Luna, Mercury, Venus, Sol, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, corresponding in each case to a different note of the diatonic scale. So that's Pythagoras' idea of the music of the spheres. All right, so remember this image here as we go through these paintings. Remember Apollo here with the Graces over here and the flowers over here, as we take a look at some of these ideas that are translated into concepts by the Renaissance maestros. Here's Titian with Sacred and Profane Love from 1514. It's early in his career. It's an absolute masterpiece. So in this tradition, and it comes from Plato, there are 2 Venuses. You get, because the world isn't just sensuously beautiful to the 5 senses, it's also beautiful to the mind, to the ratio, which can comprehend it and view the forms and then connect with them. So the Venus Vulgare is the Venus who is clothed. She is the Venus of nature, the realm of the senses. And in astrology, Venus on the natal chart points to sensory pleasure, whether that is sex, art, music, food, etc. That's all Venusian in astrology. But now the celestial Venus, or also known as Venus Urania, sort of combining her with that 9th muse, Urania, is unclothed, just like I mentioned in Anna. When she goes down through those 7 gates, she stands unclothed, and she is the planet Venus. So this is a very old tradition. That's 3500 BC, and that's just writing. Usually, by the time myths are committed to writing, they've been passed down orally for centuries before that point. So this could go back to 4,000 or 5,000 BC. It may even go back into the Neolithic. Here we have the double goddess. This is a transformation of the archetype of the double goddess, which began in high Bronze Age civilization with the separation of Inanna from her sister Ereshkigal. Inanna, as the planet Venus, is the mistress of the great above, but as Ereshkigal in the underworld, she is the mistress of the great below. Originally, she was 2-headed. This is from Anatolia, Turkey, which is basically the homeland of the goddess. Cybele comes from there. And so we can see that the 2-headed goddess goes way back. This is 6,000 or 7,000 BC here at Ain Ghazal, which is a site in Palestine that created these creepy ancestor worship type lime plaster poured over these frames, wood frames. And here she is again, the double goddess before she has split. We can track her going into the New World. Here she is as a pretty lady of Tlatilco, which I believe is near Peru, or in Peru, somewhere in that area. It might be Ecuador, 1200 BC. And here she is again. She is not yet separated into the 2, Demeter and Persephone, Inanna and Ereshkigal, but she will. So let's take a look at Botticelli's Primavera, which is a very complex statement. Now notice that right away the architecture here, if you swap out Venus for Apollo in Gafforis's diagram, here we have those 3 Graces again on the left. And then we have another triad over here, in this case, the goddess Flora. Remember that basket or that jar of flowers to the left of Apollo in Gafforis's diagram? Here it is again. And so what we have is the life process of Venus Vulgare, the terrestrial Venus, the Venus that finds beauty in all things of nature, in the physical human body, in the genitals, in the flowers of the earth, and everything is beautiful on this rock. And that's what Venus Vulgare is about. It's not just a simple identification as the Christians make the mistake of denigrating the genitals and denigrating sex as unworthy of beauty. That's totally wrong. That's just as wrong gets. Everything is beautiful, including sex. Now here we have Zephyr, who is coming down in the role of Pluto, who comes up from the underworld to kidnap Persephone. But here it's in the role of Zephyr, coming to abduct a nymph named Chloris. And as he grabs her, she of course corresponds to Persephone exactly. As she's dying, flowers are coming out of her mouth, because from death comes life. That's the myth of the sacrifice. And here is Flora herself, the goddess of all beautiful vegetation, just strewing the world with seeds and flowers everywhere. We're living in a garden of beauty. We just don't even know it. So now here is Venus. Notice that her hair is copper. Venus is associated with the metal of copper. She may come from the island of Cyprus, where there's a very large copper mine. I don't know if it's still there, but anciently it was. And her child up here, Cupid, blindfolded, but pointing an arrow very specifically at the middle of the Graces, which we saw in the previous diagram was Talia. But here they're personifications of beauty, pulchritudo and chastity. She represents chastity here in the center. Pulchritudo and chastity, and the third one, Euphrosyne. And her eyes she has only eyes for Mercury. Mercury is over here, standing here. He's aloof. He's indifferent to this whole love-death melodrama that's going on down here on the physical plane in the realm of Plato's becoming. And he's more interested in using ratio, the intellect, to discern the clouds. That is to say, to look up to the Platonic forms, to look up to Gophorius's diagram with all the planets in it, which frees the mind from the fetters of the merely sensual, but also returns by way of a vinculum, which is the Latin term for a circuit, whereby the mind is illuminated by the forms and then comes back to physical nature with a much greater appreciation for the incarnation of the forms married to pure potentia, pure matter. And then so this whole painting sort of corresponds to Venus Vulgare, whereas his painting here, the birth of Venus from about 1484 to 86, somewhere in there, is now back to the Urania, Venus Urania, the celestial Urania. He's basing this on a myth that is recounted by Hesiod in the Theogony of the birth of Venus. There are two Venuses because the one in Hesiod is from the castrated genitals of Uranus, which are thrown into the ocean. Aphros, Aphrodite. Aphros means foam. She is the foam-board one. And a second Venus whose mother is Dione by Zeus. So how is it that there are two totally different Venus births? And Plato, I guess, reconciles it by saying that we have a vulgar Venus and a Urania, a celestial Venus. And here she is. She's about to be clothed with matter, with the subtle body, the astral body, the etheric body, and so forth from the Theosophical tradition. And she's in the role of Inanna, standing naked before her sister, who is then swapped out here for this woman, who is Irene. She's one of the hours. She represents time, temporality, the seasons, and fate. That's the hours. But also materiality, the physical body, and also the etheric body, which is what we share in common with plants, and the astral body, which is waking consciousness, Spengler's Vox sign, which we share in common with the animals. And she's on a half shell here because the half shell is a symbol for the vagina. So it's a cosmic vagina, and here you can see the prototype that it's based on is Venus Anadyomene, or Anadymene, from a lost work by the great painter Apelles, who we've lost all his paintings, but he's got a reputation that's like the classical equivalent of Rembrandt. And here she is sitting on a half shell, which very much more resembles a vagina than it does in the Christian tradition of Botticelli, where the genitals are forbidden for some odd reason. And then so she's blowing in, she's coming in and landing possibly on the island of Cyprus or Knidos. And here we have Zephyr once again blowing the winds. This is the spirit of God that hovers over the abyss on the first page of the book of Genesis, dropping roses as boons that are coming down to the earth. And he's with Aura, which is another one of the winds, and she is Irene, from which the name Irene comes. And so those are the two Venuses as we find them, as the two conceptions of the Venus Urania and the terrestrial Venus. And there's even this guy, I found this site just sort of randomly. I guess it's this guy, James Sven, who figured out that using mathematics that we can find the Venus pentagram in Botticelli's painting, which is astonishing because that pentagram, which has 5 points, is the shape that the planet Venus makes in the sky every 8 years. So both 8 and 5, as well as the number 6 actually, are all numbers associated with Venus. And it's astonishing to me that if this guy is right, that this was all figured out to create the shape of a 5-pointed star, because they knew that the cycle made by Venus is the planet Venus, and it's the symbol of Inanna. Inanna used to have the exact same star, only her star had 8 points on it to indicate the 8 years for the cycle as it would unfold. And then, okay, so let's take a look at Michelangelo for a moment. We've got the tombs of the Medici. And Michelangelo is full of all things Neoplatonic. You can go through all of his work and find Neoplatonic references and so forth. So here we have the tombs. He built 2 tombs for the Medici. The tomb of Julius II was just an agon that he never quite finished. He was wrestling, and that's the tomb with the famous Moses figure. That he never did quite finish, and it certainly wasn't ever finished in accordance with his vast, ambitious plan for these things. You got to keep in mind here that Michelangelo's imagination was much, much larger than the actuality of the ability for his hands to sculpt, because with sculpted matter, and he knows this, he's imprinting Platonic forms into pure, receptive female matter that receives the imprint, the masculine imprint of the form of the spirit imprinted into the marble block as he's releasing these forms from their prisons. All of his dying slaves are allegories of the idea of the soul being in bondage to the body, which goes all the way back to the Orphics, who date roughly from about, the Orphic hymns date from about the same time as the Corpus Hermeticum and Plotinus and all those guys, the Gnostics as well. So this is a very long tradition that the 15th and 16th centuries of the Renaissance is keeping alive, keeping that flame burning. So here we have the tomb of Lorenzo, but not the great Lorenzo, the Lorenzo the Lesser. And he's in a pensive mood. He corresponds to Milton's poem Il Penseroso, the pensive one. And the tomb is meant to oppose the other Medici, Giuliano, who is the active one. So we have also in Neoplatonism these 2 archetypes of the vita contemplativa, that's the contemplative life, and the vita activa. And so Giuliano represents the vita contemplativa, il penseroso, whereas the other guy here, Lorenzo, represents the vita activa. He's not withdrawn in on himself. He's out there. He's extroverted, and the other guy is introverted. But note that these, what Panofsky calls river gods, and no one else seems to refer to them as that. The ones for Giuliano are night and day, so they're personifications of night and day, and for Lorenzo, the personifications are for dawn and dusk. But I think it's interesting that in his book Studies in Iconology, Panofsky equates them with because he says they're river gods. And they are indeed rendered by Michelangelo in the pose of the traditional iconotype of a river god. And they represent in that sense the 4 rivers of the underworld, Acheron, Styx, Phlegethon, and Cocytus. Those are the 4 rivers of the underworld, which Michelangelo then wants you to connect with the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and the 4 principles that brought the 4 elements into being: the hot, the cold, the wet, the dry, according to Aristotle, and also the 4 humors that correspond to the temperaments of the Saturnine disposition and the phlegmatic disposition and the melancholic disposition and so on. So they had all this woven together, this beautiful cosmology that was woven together in terms of groups of 4. That is to say, sort of like Jungian mandalas, repeated and reiterated over and over again. It's always 4 this, 4 that. And in my novels, the new one is out, Every Angel is Terrifying, and I'm just now finishing up the 2nd novel in the trilogy, Motorcycle Girl Descends into Hell. Also, the number 4 will turn up there again and again in connection, not just with this ancient Hermetic Neoplatonic cosmology, but with our current scientific cosmology, which has 4 fundamental forces instead of the 4 elements. Instead, if you get rid of Aristotle's hot, cold, wet, and dry, and move the element of fire to the top, and the heaviest element, water isn't the heaviest element, which is traditionally opposed to fire, change that to earth, and you end up with the 4 fundamental forces with gravity at the bottom in the place of earth, and at the top you've got the force of electromagnetism, and then to the left and right you have the strong and the weak forces that bond the nucleus together. The strong force holds it together, And the weak force, weak is traditionally female, lets it go. Lets the radioactive electrons go, and so forth. Whereas the strong force is more Saturnine. It's more like the father. It wants to hold and hoard all of its children into one capture. As Arthur Young puts it in his wonderful book, The Reflexive Universe, where he takes the scientific paradigm and he says that it fits the Gnostic and hence Neoplatonic as well. I know Plotinus was against the Gnostics, but they do have a lot in common. All of these movements with the Orphic hymns and the Corpus Hermeticum, they're all interconvertible conceptually when you actually sit down and look at them. So we've got those four fundamental forces, which is the Faustian version of the four elements, because they're forces. And so in addition to that, we have four chronological epochs as well. We've got the Hadean epoch, which goes back to 4.5 or 6 billion years ago. Then the Archean epoch, where life begins to first come into being with these little tiny bacteria 3.8 billion years ago. So we've got Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, which is where we're getting multicellular organisms in the ocean at about this time, but still no life yet on land. And then finally, about 570 million years ago, we get the Cambrian explosion, and that's the Phanerozoic eon. These are described as 4 eons, and we are still in the 4th eon, according to our scientific model. Isn't that interesting, how even in contemporary science, which thinks it has conquered, dismantled, and gotten rid of all of these ancient cosmologies, that we could still see them there. If you know how to look at them, you know where to look. As my female protagonist, the young girl in my novels, does. She has a brain, and she knows where to look and where to see the continuities with the ancient Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Gnostic tradition and contemporary cosmology. And then, so the other thing too about that, with the river gods as representatives of time, basically, dawn and dusk and night and day, they represent Plato's realm of the becoming, the realm of continual death and resurrection, sex, death. I have a section in my new novel, Motorcycle Girl Descends into Hell, that goes through the history of human death and burial, and inserted in between each description of the different types of death, there is a major sex scene that the female protagonist, who's about 23 years old, participates in. So I capture that pendulation of sex and death, that forms the major spinal backbone of the second novel in my trilogy. Nothing is accidental in these novels, despite what it looks like at first when you glance at them. They look like just a girl's random scrapbook with a bunch of neat images. Hey, look at this. Hey, look at that. No. Pay attention to the images. They link, they weave, they link back to each other, they refer to each other, and they form a cosmic tapestry. So you got to be aware of what you're reading. And then so the characters up here, the Medici, represent the soul in its discarnate form here. And in the case here of Lorenzo being very pensive, contemplating the forms, contemplating the mystery of the realm of becoming, while the other guy here, Giuliano, is out there doing things, making decisions, causing things to happen, making new things happen in Florence and so forth. It's funny too, if you think about Goethe, he embodies both. Goethe was both a politician in Weimar. He basically ran the city. His friend, the Duke, I forget his name, a young guy who basically turned the city over to him and said, here, do what you want with it. And so he did, and Goethe transformed Weimar from a swamp, a provincial swamp, into a major center of art and culture, equivalent to Athens, equivalent to 5th century Athens. And it's all just this one man who is able to practice both lives, the vita contemplativa and the vita activa. Goethe was a maestro. No two ways about that. And then so I'll finish here by linking back to where we started with Gaffurius. We have Apollo in place of Venus. We do have the Graces over here sending their, like in Kabbalah, in Jewish Kabbalah, the force of the light that comes down through the Sephirot. And instead of the Sephirot, we have the Muses and the planets and the splendor of the god, here in this case it's Apollo, going down through the planets and into our various astral bodies, the subtle body composed of the etheric, the astral body, and the ego, and incarnation down on the physical plane, and you wake up and you go, wow, there's a world out here. What is all this? You've just come out of the womb. Now what are you going to do?